I'm your host, Ed Doyle, and these are Tales of Fame and Fate. You know, we've all heard the story of those that grew up in rags and ended up in riches. Struggling families trying to stave off hunger for their families while giving them all they could in love and guidance and teaching them the fortitude to get better from life than their parents had. Doing what they could as a family to keep themselves entertained, the family get-togethers, the sing-alongs, the good times in the face of bad. In this tale of fame and fate, we take one such example of a man who was one of 8 children in a poor family that went from the projects of Houston to riches. Kenny Rogers was born on August 21st, 1938, at St. Joseph's Infirmary in Houston, Texas. His father was Edward Floyd Rogers. He tried to scrape out a living as a carpenter, but unfortunately also lost many jobs because he was also a well-known alcoholic. And Kenny's mother was Lucille Lois Hester, a nurse's assistant that only had a 3rd grade education, helping out as she could around the hospital. Unfortunately also didn't make much money. By the time Kenny came along, the family already had 3 young children to feed, so they were very poor. As one of 8 children, Kenny Rogers grew up, as many poor children did, trying to survive living in public housing in Houston. Later known as the Allen Parkway Village Housing Project, the San Felipe Courts were originally built to house white defense workers and their families. And that is where Kenny Rogers grew up. Kenny recalled growing up there in the segregated 4th Ward of Houston, and had said that at that young age, he remembered the fence that was put up to separate the white and the black sections. And he often wondered, why would people be separated like that? Later, Kenny attended Wharton Elementary School and was just an average student, but that's the way Kenny liked it. He had said that his main goal in school, believe it or not, was anonymity. Unfortunately, though, for Kenny, that was far from the case. He was often in the eye of his teachers because of being such a hyper kid. He said that even though back then there was no such diagnosis of attention deficit disorder, he believed he probably indeed suffered from it. He was labeled as just being a kid with too much energy and being a little scatterbrained. Music was something, though, that Kenny Rogers' entire family loved. His father, Edward Rogers, and his father's brothers and sisters all played one instrument or another. Kenny had told Rolling Stone magazine in an interview that on the weekends they would all pile into the back of the old pickup truck and drive up to Apple Springs, where they would all get together and listen to his aunts and uncles sing and play music on the front porch. He loved to sing as a child, and he also loved to sing as a teen. He did so in church choirs and in local glee clubs. Kenny wanted to do more with his music, so he got a job working as a busboy at the local Rice Hotel in downtown Houston so that he could earn enough money to buy his first real guitar. Kenny went on to attend Jefferson Davis High School. It was in high school that this young, average guitar player found his first membership in a band when he and his buddy formed the band The Scholars. They were a doo-wop group that got together as Kenny had put it, basically for the reason of having fun and meeting girls. He said money was never in their minds when they first started the band, and later when they started getting paid, they couldn't believe how great it was and wanted more. Kenny said that not long after the band was formed, one of his classmates pleaded with him to join the band. That classmate was none other than Mickey Newbury, who would eventually become one of the most respected singer-songwriters of the time, and the writer of Kenny's 1960s first edition breakout hit, Just Dropped In. During his time with the Scholars, Kenny would sing, as many put it, high and sweet. The band actually became quite popular and actually recorded a few songs that became local Houston hits. The Scholars evolved from a high school band to one that would actually sign a contract with Dot Records. They would record the singles Spin the Wheel and Poor Little Doggy, and in 1957 sign a contract with Imperial Records. The group recorded the song with Imperial, I Didn't Want to Do It. But it wasn't long after that recording that the lead singer would leave the group, and they would break up. Kenny would venture out in his first solo try and build himself as Kenneth Rogers, and would record the song That Crazy Feeling, which actually became a big enough hit to get him his first invitation to American Bandstand. In 1960, Kenny would team up with Bobby Doyle and Don Russell, and they would become the Bobby Doyle Three. The trio would perform jazz and blues with Kenny on vocals and bass, along with Bobby Doyle, who, by the way, was in fact blind since birth, was on the keyboard and vocals, Don Russell also on vocals and drums. This band worked hard, sometimes playing 12 hours a day, playing happy hours, then would go on later to the nightclubs, and even into the wee hours of the morning doing after-hours gigs. They actually accompanied such singers as Liza Minnelli, even Tony Bennett. With the band for 5 years, Kenny Rogers finally caught the attention of the folk group, the Christy Minstrels. They at the time were looking for a bass guitarist that could also hit the high notes. He performed with the Christy Minstrels for only a year when he and other members felt that they were being held back by the type of music that the band was doing, and they wanted to do more of what the late 60 listeners wanted, groovy rock and roll. So they would leave and form the First Edition. With the First Edition, Kenny played bass and also sang, and he would, with them, record the band's national breakout song, I Just Dropped In. As the band developed and Kenny sang more and more lead, it morphed into Kenny Rogers and the First Edition. Kenny wanted to go back to his roots, and while recording an album, the band needed one more song to use as a filler on the album. Kenny spoke up and said that he knew a Mel Tillis song called Ruby, Don't Take Your Love to Town. They recorded it in only 2 takes, and the song went in the album as planned, just as a filler song to complete the record. The song became a hit. It became such a hit that many would also record this song. Legends such as Carl Perkins, Roger Miller, Jerry Reed, all in their own style. And it would even be recorded by none other than Mr. Spock himself, Leonard Nimoy. Kenny Rogers in the First Edition would go on to record songs and hits such as But You Know I Love You, Reuben James, at the time the very controversial Something's Burning, Elvira, and many, many more. During this time, Kenny Rogers formed his own record label, Jolly Rogers, which was distributed by MGM. In 1972, the band released their first country music LP on the Jolly Rogers label called Back Roads. But instead of relying on some of their more popular songs to put on the album, they decided to record a number of cover song remakes. And with the band's popularity already starting to decline, the album did little to help. The band was chosen to be hosts for the TV show Rollin, which would be filmed in Canada. It kept them in the eyes of audiences mainly because they knew how to entertain an audience. But with their fame waning, in 1975, fellow founder Terry Williams would leave the group. Kenny had said that when Williams left, it took the heart out of the first edition. He said that Terry was the comedy, and without him, they were just really boring. In 1976, with the band dispersed, Kenny set out once again on a solo career. He would go on to perform many of the first edition's hits and meet Larry Butler, who would eventually produce most of Rogers' major hits. Rogers, looking back at that set of Butler, he believed in me, and that is what made all the difference for me. During this time, Kenny Rogers' career began to soar. He became the heartthrob of women and the envy of men all over the world. There wasn't a moment that could go by when you either heard his song playing on a radio station or out of the mouths of people walking down the street. He inspired young musicians, songwriters, and singers to venture out and try to become what Kenny Rogers had become, including yours truly. Yes, I was a young singer-songwriter playing solo nightclubs, trying to do what Kenny did, playing many of his songs. The reason that Kenny Rogers became the legend that he is today was because of his love of his fans and of entertaining. Kenny's career, as it was soaring so high, would bring him to both television and film. He appeared on the TV show Dolly, then the 11th Annual Country Music Association Awards show, and even have bit parts and his music in TV shows such as BJ and the Bear, WKRP in Cincinnati, Knight Rider, and many more. He would star in movies, starting with Six Pack as a race car driver, The Gambler, Coward of the County, The Gambler Returns, and more. Kenny Rogers was eventually behind over 120 hit singles. His closest friend and partner of many a memorable song was none other than Dolly Parton. Rogers and Parton had something very deep in common. They both grew up in poverty with very large families. The two met in 1983. While Rogers was struggling with the song Islands in the Stream for days, he tried to get that song to sound right, but just couldn't. Dolly Parton was called and asked if she would join him in the recording session. She obliged, and within an hour was at the recording studio. Rogers and Parton recorded the song, and not only did the song become a hit, but it was from that meeting that the two of them just clicked, and they would become lifelong friends. They began to tour together, and it strengthened the friendship into an inseparable bond that would last till the day he died. They would record together the songs Love is Strange, Real Love, the Christmas song Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire, You Can't Make Old Friends, and arguably one of country music's most memorable songs played to this day, Islands in the Stream. During his career, Kenny lived life large. As so many that grew up in poverty, Kenny wanted all that he could get. And why not? He earned the money doing what he loved, and he worked hard for every penny of it. Unfortunately, though, just like his song, Kenny Rogers was a gambler, but not with money. Instead, Kenny gambled with love, and unfortunately, he was not lucky. Kenny married 5 times in his life, with 4 divorces. At 19 years old, his first marriage was to Janice Gordon, and they had his first child, daughter Carol Lynn. They went their separate ways and divorced in 1960. Months later, Kenny met and married his second wife, Jean Rogers. Kenny had said later in life that the reason that the marriage ended was because they both just realized that they weren't right for each other, and that the marriage ended up becoming boring for the both of them. They would divorce in 1963. Kenny's third marriage was to Tamago Anderson in 1964. Out of that marriage, Kenny's second child would be born, Kenny Jr. He said that the first 9 years of this marriage was as good as marriage can get. But later, with Kenny's heavy touring and lack of attention to his wife, 3 years later, they also would end up in divorce. His fourth wife was Maryann God, none other than the actress from the movie Rosemary's Baby. They tied the knot in 1977 and were married for almost 20 years. Kenny's third child, son Chris, would be born in 1982. But unfortunately, like the others, this marriage struggled with Kenny's constant touring, and according to Maryann, Kenny seemed to be going through a midlife crisis. She said that he felt that his career was fading and that she just didn't have his full attention any longer. They would eventually divorce in 1993. In 1997, Kenny would finally marry Wanda Miller. The couple had met in the mid-90s and truly fell in love. They became mom and dad of 2 sons, Justin and Jordan. In an interview, Kenny Rogers sounded like a schoolboy in love. He said that he and Wanda had been together for almost 20 years and married 15 of them, and that she was his soulmate. She was 28 years younger than Kenny, but he said that she knew him better than anyone ever had. During Kenny's career, he earned over $250 million. But Kenny loved to spend it too. He was an entrepreneur that sometimes got into businesses that didn't do so well. He helped build a 425 restaurant chain named Kenny Rogers Roasters. It was a rotisserie chicken-based restaurant that he formed along with former KFC CEO John Brown Jr. The chain only lasted a few years, though, and it closed all of its U.S. locations and only had a few left in Asia. Unfortunately, the chain also required no licensing fees for the use of Kenny Rogers' name, leaving his family with no revenue from it. As Kenny's career winded down, the little bit of royalties every time one of his songs would be played also dwindled. The biggest hit to his fortune was his fourth divorce, in which he had to surrender $60 million to settle it. Kenny knew how to make money, though, and he was great at buying real estate and flipping houses and mansions. He made tremendous profits, including at the time a record-setting flip of a mansion in Beverly Hills that sold for $20 million. In 2015, Kenny announced that this would be his final tour. When he announced his final tour, Rogers said the reason that it was happening was that he just didn't want to take forever to retire. This would be his Gambler's Last Deal tour. But in 2018, some health challenges forced him to cut the tour short. He said that the last 2 years on the Gambler's Last Deal tour that he thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity to say farewell to his fans and felt that there was no way that he could show just how much he felt about the encouragement and support that they had all given him throughout the years and the happiness that he had gained from it. On March 20th, 2020, Kenny Rogers, at his home in Georgia, would pass away. His music and his memories living on forever. But unfortunately, Kenny Rogers is not in his final resting place as of yet. Because of the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic at the time of his death, unfortunately, the funeral that was planned for him by his wife, one to be as spectacular as the life that he lived, was put on hold. Until that time that we can get back to normalcy, Kenny lies in waiting for the time that he can be surrounded by his fans and his friends to say one last goodbye. Whether this lifelong fan will be there to say goodbye in person or not, like many, I'm sure I will shed another tear. Goodbye, Kenny Rogers.
Wanted you for life, you and me in the wind. I never thought there'd come a time that our story would end. It's hard to understand, but I guess I'll have to try. It's not easy to say goodbye. For all the joy we shared, all that time we had to spend. If I had one wish, I'd want forever back again. To look into your eyes, hold you when you cry. It's not easy to say goodbye. I remember all those good times we had, so many memories, some good and some bad. Yes, and through it all, those memories will last forever. There's peace in where you are. Maybe all I need to know. If I listen to my heart, I hear your laughter once more. So I have to say, I'm just glad you came my way. It's not easy to say goodbye. Goodbye.